cobalamin. Deficiencies are much more common as we age because we're not making the factor, it's called intrinsic factor, that allows us to absorb the cobalamin. Atrophic gastritis is another example. Also vegetarians. Unfortunately, the only B12 sources are meat. There really aren't any vegetable sources. The vegetarians who choose to supplement are usually going to be taking something considered synthetic but works pretty well called cyanocobalamin. And it does well enough for most people. The people that are severely deficient in B12 are going to need injections, though, and there's no getting around it. But the response can be very, very quick if permanent nerve damage hasn't been done. But B12 deficiency, this is the one that if you don't get it, it can give you permanent nerve damage to brain and peripheral nerves. Find it in liver, meat, egg yolk, poultry, and milk. Folic acid, again, your alcoholics are going to have a deficiency, but also people who are poor, malnourished, malabsorption. Folic acid is found in leafy green vegetables. And, in the South, when I think of poor people, everybody has some greens growing in their yard, mustard greens or turnip greens, and they're nice. They sort of self-seed themselves. But I think that's rare. I think people that are living in the inner city, if they're poor, the only thing that they can get is processed food. That's the only thing they've got access to. And it's typically going to be very low in folic acid. I can talk about the South because I live here. Now, biotin. There's no RDA for it. It's found in many foods. It's also produced by intestinal bacteria. But it's incredibly important. It's important in the production of fatty acids, the metabolism of fats and amino acids, and energy production, as well as being that cofactor for producing some of the neurotransmitters. Vitamin C, I think we all know we're going to find that in citrus fruits, berries, sauerkraut, calf liver. And vitamin D, I did put it in here. Deficiencies are incredibly common. 1 billion people deficient worldwide. 4,000 units a day to maintain your vitamin D levels. And the key is that it's going to increase that tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the rate-limiting step in catecholamine biosynthesis. So without vitamin D, you're not going to have enough dopamine. You're not going to have enough norepinephrine. You're not going to have enough epinephrine. So those are all very important there. This is my source, vitamindcouncil.com. It's a fantastic, fantastic resource. They're not selling anything except information on vitamin D. And this is where I got my current, modern, up-to-date education on vitamin D, because what I learned in medical school, and probably what they're still teaching in medical school, is definitely out of date. And this 200, 400, 600 units of vitamin D is laughably, pathetically small.
Right.
So we're learning we actually need a lot more than that.
I didn't know it had so many uses, really. I didn't know it had so many. I mean, I'm sure they're still being taught in medical school that vitamin D is basically for the bones and for what else? I mean, still.
Yeah, it tells your intestine to absorb calcium, and it tells your body to put the calcium in the bone. That's all I learned. But right, so we talked about tyrosine hydroxylase. It helps regulate blood pressure. It turns on and off. Actually, 10% of those genes. Do you remember I said there are about 20,000 genes? About 2,000 of them are regulated by vitamin D. Vitamin D is the substance that's actually turning these things on and off. And just one simple, just have to throw this in here because vitamin D is so important. A simple study they did in Nebraska, the thing to understand, even though vitamin D is a sunshine vitamin, you can't get enough of it if you live above the 37th parallel. And that's a line roughly North Carolina all the way across the northern, the northern edge of Arizona, New Mexico, to right about San Francisco, just below San Francisco. If you live above that, you can't get enough vitamin D in the winter, no matter what you do. And if you have dark skin, you're going to absorb less, any time of year. So when you realize that, they did a simple study in Nebraska, which is clearly north of that line I described, and they gave women 2,000 units of vitamin D a day. These are menopausal women, and they were looking for 2 endpoints. One was cancer incidence, because they knew it had an association with cancer, and the other was bone mineral density. And at 2 years, that vitamin D had cut the risk of cancer by 75%.
Wow.
So that's why I emphasize is the nutrients are very important in what they're doing to the way your genes are expressed can happen very quickly. You see, if you think about 2 years and you cut the risk by 75% or the incidence by 75%, that's mind-boggling.
Yes, it is.
Now, other micronutrients, magnesium, extrememe important. Remember I said it's extremely rare, but fortunately you find it in leafy green vegetables. In fact, the molecule chlorophyll looks a lot like hemoglobin, like we have red blood cells that have hemoglobin. Chlorophyll looks just like heme, but instead of having iron in the middle, it's got magnesium. So your leafy greens are always going to be a good source of magnesium. Also, whole grains, legumes are going to be good sources as well. Manganese may be found in pineapple, leafy greens, raspberries, maple, molasses, and soybeans. Copper, copper may be found in organ meats, seafoods, wheat germ, green vegetables, prunes, legumes again, sweet potatoes, walnuts, peanuts, cashews. Again, it sounds like a smorgasbord, but the point is, if we're eating a varied diet, we should be at least have the baseline nutrients. Some of us are going to have to supplement with more. Iron. This is interesting. Iron is usually going to be found in the same place as copper is found, but some people have to be careful. About 0.5% of the population has an iron storage problem called hemochromatosis. But we find iron storage problems much more common in people with chronic diseases, up to 15%. So I don't recommend that people just randomly go take iron preparations, especially if you have chronic illness. You may be one of the people that's got too much iron. Deficiency is 2 to 11%. People with iron deficiency, 2 to 11%, and the deficiency is going to be higher in toddlers and adolescent girls.
Why is that? Because they're just menstruating?
Yeah, because they're beginning menstruation, and their diet's routinely not the greatest either. And the toddlers, that's one of the reasons that we check that's one of the reasons that we're checking for anemia in one of the well baby checks. One of the things to do is get a finger stick or something, or draw a blood level and be sure there's no signs of anemia, because it actually is going to affect their learning. They cannot learn as well if they have iron deficiency anemia. That's been very well demonstrated. But how do we find it? And this is, if there are any clinicians out there, obviously it's not just iron levels. You need to know, is the body binding the iron properly? Is it oversaturated? What's the ferritin looking like? Because you want to be sure that this is not a situation where the iron level's low, but the body's telling you there's too much iron floating around, and it's beginning to have trouble storing it. You're going to find iron in liver, oysters, clams, beef, turkey, and there is some in the legumes, cereals, and spinach, but it's less absorbable. It's what we call non-heme iron, and it's a little bit more difficult to absorb, so you need to eat more of those foods if you're a vegetarian to get your iron. Zinc is going to be found in poultry, beef, oysters, beans, nuts, crabs, lobster, and dairy. I know, so like I said, I've mentioned an entire smorgasbord. I'm ready to eat, but the point is to get a varied diet. There's a critical relationship between zinc and copper. Now, if you begin to have a zinc deficiency, which I said is probably easier for men than women, just because the men use the zinc differently, they need more of it. But once you begin to have that deficiency, anybody is at risk for it. The copper tends to go up, and that copper excess actually drives the zinc deficiency, which drives the copper excess. So it's possible for these two to get completely out of kilter. And it's one of the reasons, again, I think if you have any sort of, issues at all, if you don't think your brain's working perfectly, I'd say work with somebody who does this for a living, because there are more and more people looking into these things now, and it's worth checking levels for some of these things. Last few